about that. You know that her poetry, on the whole, was not published until after her death. In fact, it wasn't discovered until after she died. Only about 11 poems were published during her lifetime.
And in altered form in many cases.
Yes, that too. And the first editors certainly edited the poems as we talked about in Because I Could Not Stop for Death. But I wonder if she had been published in her lifetime, what effect she would have had on poetry in this country. And I wonder what it would have meant to the history of American poetry had poets been reading her in the 19th century when she actually wrote those poems.
I think she would have blasted us into the modern age infinitely quicker than we were blasted by World War I.
Yeah, but it is speculative.
Yes, and in a much nicer way.
Yes.
And the rest is history. Emily Dickinson and death. This is a voice that would not be silenced.
And I think the 20th century has increasingly seen that in that way. Her sister-in-law wrote the obituary after her death and talked about Dickinson's sound. My American literature professor, when I was an undergraduate, talked about the difference between American and English poetry and said that English poets were brought up on the models of poets centuries, generations before them, and that what had emerged was an English sound, what T.S. Eliot calls the auditory imagination. And my professor claimed that American poetry just doesn't have that. I think that's true to a certain extent, but I don't think it's because they lack auditory imagination. I think it's because it's different. It's American. May I read you what Sue wrote?
Please.
Her talk and her writings were like no one else's. Her swift, poetic rapture was like the long, glistening note of a bird one hears in the June woods at high noon, but can never see. That's Dickinson.
It is, and she has her immortality with us. Margaret, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
By way of introduction to the composer Robert Charles, let's look at his setting of the touching poem, How the Waters Closed Above Him. Perhaps we can review some of Margaret Freeman's literary terminology and begin to think also in terms of musical values. I will read you the poem and then sing it for you. How the waters closed above him, we shall never know. How he stretched his anguish to us, that is covered too. Spreads the pond its base of lilies bold above the boy, whose unclaimed hat and jacket sum the history. This is a brief word picture, a reflection on a tragic event, the drowning of a boy. The speaker stands before us as the universal mourner, in awe before the cold finality of death, the great mystery. We may ask how with that speaker, but the answer, like the boy, lies beneath the surface of the water. Although this poem is lyric, even gentle in tone, we can clearly hear in it the plain-spoken, sinewy qualities of the American poetic voice that Margaret Freeman spoke of. And notice the use of parallelism, so common to the Bible and to the poetry of Emily Dickinson. How the waters closed above him, how he stretched his anguish to us. With these two parallel questions, we can ourselves as readers begin to question the nature of death. Let's see now how our composer, Robert Charles, has set this lovely poem to music. As the music begins, you will hear a lovely melody emerge from the rocking motion in the movement between the depth of the left hand and the surface movement of the right. This music describes the almost gentle movement of the pond's surface, but beneath it is the pond's depth, where the hidden struggle with death takes place. The voice enters unobtrusively in a chanting, almost mournful fashion. stretched his anguish to us. That is covered too. Unclaimed hat and jacket, some the history. And there is now an ascending passage in the music, which may represent the rising of the boy's soul, or a prayer, or whatever you decide. Note that the music is fully in service of the words here. The meaning of the poem is both enhanced and augmented by the musical setting. I said earlier that death and immortality were not subjects that we spoke of easily, despite their universal nature. In this regard, I think our composer has taught us a very important lesson here concerning the nature and function of art. It is the nature of art to bring out the inherent beauty in all of human experience, tragic or comic. Robert Charles responded to this tragic poem by creating music that can accurately be described as both touching and lovely. He has raised the level of our consciousness. Let me introduce you now to Dr. Robert Charles, the composer of the song cycle Songs of Great Men and Death. Bob, before we look at your settings of Death is the Supple Suitor and Because I Could Not Stop for Death, could we talk about the challenge that the composer faces when he sets good poetry?
Well, in general, poets don't write poetry with the intent of its being set to music. This is the job of the lyricist, and lyrics are very, very different from poetry. Poets have other purposes. Most good poetry is full of its own internal verbal music, including complex sounds, patterns, and rhythms. Certainly the poetry of Emily Dickinson is is distinctive in this matter and very complex. At any rate, most good poems are complete in and of themselves, don't really need music. And there are certainly easier poems than Emily Dickinson's to set to music. She uses short lines and short phrases almost exclusively, despite the fact that her verse form is based on the highly rhythmic hymn form. The lines that she has in her poetry and her phrases are highly irregular in rhythm. It isn't immediately accessible. You might say it lies deep in the poem as a whole, and it can be appreciated only through careful reading and consideration.
Like any strongly individualistic artist, she exercises enormous freedom within the confines of a narrow form, in this case, the hymn form. Bob, it seems to me that the challenge was great for you in setting these poems. It's such a great task to take a complete work of art, like a poem, and set it into a musical environment, and realize that mixture of forms without in any way violating or being obtrusive to the poem. Bob, could you say a little about the tension between poetic form and musical form?
Well, you see, poetry has meaning because it uses words. Words, by definition, tell us something. Music, on the other hand, must be repeated in order to be appreciated, and musical elements such as melody, rhythm, and harmony don't really have any meaning in and of themselves. The meaning that we ascribe to music becomes possible only by repetition of some of the musical elements, and we recognize a particular melody, for instance, and therefore we ascribe a particular meaning to that within the context of a particular song. When music encloses a literary work, such as a Dickinson poem, the repetitions allow the listener to understand what happened earlier in the poem. What the composer tries to do is to fit the poem into a musical form involving patterns of repetition.
Bob, Margaret Freeman, a well-known Dickinson scholar and a fan of yours, says that she thinks you're the ideal composer for Emily Dickinson's poetry because your variety of musical tone and idea match perfectly, in her mind, Emily Dickinson's rhythmic complexity and great variety of voice.
Well, one of the things that I enjoyed about this project, when I started reading Dickinson poetry, I realized that she writes a lot of her poems with her tongue firmly planted in her cheek.
Very funny.
Yeah, there's a great deal of humor there, and I am by nature a comic, and my predilection is towards the comedic, so that even though this may sound strange to those people who know that Emily Dickinson deals enormously with death and the whole idea of death, yet she tries to find, I think, some comic aspects of death, or at least deals with him in a lighter manner. And this definitely struck a chord in me. Death is treated in Dickinson with a touch of charm, suavity, perhaps drollness or light irony. She portrays him as a shepherd in one poem and as a gentleman caller in another poem. But there's still this aspect of death that humans can never comprehend.
Bob, tell us more about your treatment, your development of the figure of death in your song cycle.
Well, here's an example from one of the first poems that I set, Death is the Supple Suitor. The idea of death being supple and yet somebody who is actually suing for the soul, in this case, of the female speaker of the poem. He's elegant, perhaps a little sneaky even. Death, of course, is one of those abstractions which we tend to treat with humor because to dwell on the seriousness of death isn't very much fun at all. In fact, in another song, I have him waltz away with the female speaker of the poem. This emphasizes the more elegant side of Emily Dickinson's characterization of death.
So you think of death as a character, and you think of your task as a composer as rounding out that character with musical gestures.
Yes, I think that's one aspect of my work with Dickinson's poetry. Another element is just in choosing these poems, I tried to choose the lighter characteristics of her work as often as possible. Her wit, you know, is very infectious, and it does have a musical counterpoint.
For example, the mock heroism of the speaker in your setting of the poem, I Took My Power in My Hand, in which the narrator compares herself to David, the biblical king.
But here is David as a little boy trying to screw up his courage with his slingshot in his hand to go up against the mighty Goliath. He's not too sure of himself by the end of there.
In another of your settings, you use a musical style that we think of as distinctly modern, the blues. That you set a poem written in the mid-19th century in a style that we consider so modern points out two things to me. First, that Emily Dickinson lived a long time ago and a lot of space and time separate us. And secondly, that both your arts have a strong element of universality.
Well, the line, "It always felt to me a wrong, to that old Moses done." And when she says, "to that old Moses done," it sounded a little bit like Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, "It ain't necessarily so," and it gave me the thought of this kind of bluesy treatment.
I think that setting will cause a lot of people to rethink Emily Dickinson's poetry. Could we talk a little bit about how you compose?
Well, there's a kind of gestation process. I live with the poem for a while, although that amount of time can vary. It can be anywhere from 5 minutes to a month or longer. I try to understand the poem, and some poems take a little bit more time to understand than others. The actual writing down of the notes is rather simple. In fact, when I speak to people about composing, they're a little surprised about this. I think they have a picture of a composer struggling over every note. Well, some composers, like Beethoven and Brahms, did struggle over every note. I tend to write a little bit faster, and it's just a different way of composing. And for each one of these songs, probably the fastest song may have come out in about a half an hour, whereas others may have taken a couple of hours. But I never seem to spend more than a day on any one song. I may go back later and fix up what I don't like, but the general outlines of the song are there within a fairly short period of time.
Could you give us an idea of some things that might happen in a composing session?
Well, since I'm a pianist, I get a lot of my ideas through my fingers. I sit at the keyboard, I play with literary and musical ideas, and I basically see what emerges. Sometimes I can sit down for an hour and nothing will happen. Well, a lot of things will happen. A lot of ideas will come out, and I won't like any of them. And then I either, curse and get up and have some dinner, or I put the poem aside and say, I'm not going to set this poem. It's just not going to work. And after all, there's over 1,700 poems of Dickinson. If I wanted to set more, I could. Sometimes I'll come back to it the next day, and it'll just come very easily. But once I've started on a poem, then there are certain problems that I have to deal with. If the poem or a particular line has a kind of rhythm, and this doesn't happen very frequently in Dickinson, that she has a rhythmic setting in the usual sense, well, then I have to watch out for the sing-song patterns transferring into music. This could be very dangerous and could tend to get rather boring and trite, to say the least. I do try to sense the rhythm of the poem. The rhythm of Dickinson's poetry is very difficult to grasp. You have to read the work many times. With her, sometimes you can walk, sometimes you run, and sometimes you trip. And if you trip, you just get up and try again. I also look for individual words that are strikingly descriptive. That resonate a special chord with me. For instance, in my setting of Death is the Supple Suitor, 2 words seem to stand out to set the mood of the style of the song. The first word, stealthy, describes the manner of the wooing and consequently for me sets the mood of the opening and closing of the song with this musical idea. To return to the example we just played, this is the beginning of Death is the Supple Suitor. And if you'll join me.
Death
is the supple suitor that wins at last. It is a stealthy wooing, conducted first by pallid innuendos and dim approach.
Yes, the chromaticism in there, such as we hear on stealthy wooing, was unquestionably inspired by that word stealthy. And then later on in the poem, the second important word, triumph, is led up to in